Question 53 is: Are there many descriptions of the lower spirit realms? Yes, they are mentioned in a number of spirit-communicated books, and although descriptions may differ to some degree, they are all in agreement that the lower levels are dire, to say the least. I did, of course, touch upon this subject in the answers to questions 21 and 22. However, one can be assured that those of us who lead what we may deem average or better good lives and, for instance, treat family, friends, other people, and perhaps companion animals, with love, kindness and respect will not transcend to these awful realms. There are countless spirit planes above and below the astral, which is the plane that so many communicating souls, who led reasonably average good lives on earth, seem to find themselves upon shortly after their return home to spirit life. Shortly, there is a little, paraphrased, from the same Anthony Borgia book mentioned in the previous answer. Robert Benson at this time had been taken by two spirit companions, Edwin and Ruth, to see just what these awful dark realms were like. This was not simply a case of curiosity, it was with an ultimate view to learning how he could help rescue those souls who were beginning to show any sign of spiritual light. In this he describes the bleak accommodation, scenery and appearance of the inhabitants dwelling therein. These dwellings were nothing more than mere hovels. We did not enter any of the shacks, it was repulsive enough outside. Edwin therefore gave us a few details instead. Some of the inhabitants, he said, had lived here, or hereabouts, year after year, as time is reckoned upon earth. They themselves had no sense of time, and their existence had been one of darkness through no one's fault but their own. The people living within these hovels that we were passing were not necessarily those who upon earth had committed some crime in the eyes of the earth people. There were many people who, without doing any harm, had never done any good to a single mortal upon earth. People who had lived entirely unto themselves, with no thought for others. Such souls constantly harped upon the theme that they had done no harm to anyone. But they had harmed themselves. As the higher spheres had created all the beauties of those realms, so had the denizen of those lower spheres built up the appalling conditions of their spirit life. There was no light in the lowest realms, no warmth, no vegetation, no beauty. But there is hope that every soul there will progress. It is in the power of each soul to do so, and nothing stands in his way but himself. It may take him countless thousands of years to raise himself 1 inch spiritually, but it is an inch in the right direction. We walked closer to one of the subhuman forms that lay sprawled upon the rocks. What remnant of clothing it wore might easily have been dispensed with, since it consisted of nothing but the filthiest rags. The face upon this monster was barely human, so distorted was it, and malformed. The eyes were small and penetrating, but the mouth was huge and repulsive, with thick protruding lips scarcely concealing fangs of teeth. We gazed earnestly and long at this sorry wreck of what was once a human form, and I wondered what earthly misdeeds had reduced it to this awful state of degeneration. When I first read the part above that states, such souls constantly harped upon the theme that they had done no harm to anyone, it seemed rather harsh that they should have found themselves in such terrible conditions in spirit life. However, a friend of mine pointed out the fact that a lot of people who could quite easily help other people are happy to be bystanders and watch others in difficulty but do not want to serve or help in any way. Almost as if they sit smugly and think I am not getting involved, it is not my problem. Yet these same people would expect to be helped out instantly if they had problems. Perhaps the means and opportunity to help others was deliberately presented to them to enable them to spiritually advance. In addition to communications from those in the spirit world, there are reports of the different spirit realms by people who have out-of-body experiences, and this is often called astral projection. This is when their spirit temporarily leaves the physical body, just as it can when we sleep. The difference being that they are able to remember some if not all of what they have seen or experienced during this time. One lovely book, by Fred Sculthorpe, shares his astral experiences in Excursions to the Spirit World. Fred was always accompanied on his excursions by a spirit guide who would not only guide him, but make sure he remained safe from any possible jeopardy when they visited the lower realms. The following is a small example from his book of what he witnessed, paraphrased. The lower spheres are quite Earth-like. There are cities, towns, villages, etc., which seem to be replicas of existing localities on Earth, and sometimes the conditions are similar to those on Earth. They are quite solid when the spirit body assumes the same wavelength. Many of the lower states are inhabited by people with similar predominating thoughts or tendencies, who gravitate to the same approximate wavelength in spirit. This main thought is very strong and noticeable when entering such a state. One of my most distasteful visits was to a town inhabited by those unfortunate people with quarrelsome habits. I was put down in a street, and as usual sensed the quality of the place. It was dreadful, and as I looked round, invisible to them, I saw people violently quarreling. As my awareness became more of the state, my spirit body received their thoughts. They were vicious, pitiless, and murderous. It was a hopeless place to be in, as each individual's nature was worsened by the collective thoughts of the whole. Thought is easily received by the spirit body, and the stronger the thought, the more effective it is. When two sincere friends meet on a pleasant plane, each will radiate a thought of pleasure which will be received by the other. Each recipient's pleasure is therefore doubled, and the returning thought is consequently doubled. This multiplication of the original thought many times and at electrical speed gives some idea of the happiness on some planes. When one realized the application of this same law to the dreadful state I have described, where the thoughts of hatred are exchanged, the consequences can be imagined. Fred also visited many other spheres, or levels, of the spirit world, including those he described as brighter, the higher frequencies. In some of the Earth-like levels people were living as though they were still on Earth, and in many cases the people on these frequencies do not realize or remember that they are no longer physical beings. They are still living and working as they did on Earth, and these conditions are created by the collective power of thought. Once again, some souls can be stuck in this Groundhog Day scenario for an indeterminable length of time. Another out-of-body explorer of the spirit dimensions is Jürgen Zive, and he has been taking such excursions for decades. Like Fred, he has visited both the higher and the lower levels. He also found many regions where people continue their lives in very similar fashion to how they previously lived on Earth. In one of his books, Vistas of Infinity, How to Enjoy Life When You Are Dead, it graphically illustrates the dire conditions suicide bombers, in this case, can find themselves in. Rather than finding themselves in paradise as a reward for their actions, as they are wrongly told will happen, this is what Jürgen saw. With the next powerful thunderbolt I began to regret my decision of having come here, but curiosity made me urge myself further into the region until I finally discovered that the evil billowing smoke came from piles of slowly burning human bodies who were wriggling in agony. In the very first pile I encountered, these twisting, charred and convulsing bodies were stretching their hands and clamoring towards a person who was trapped right in the center of the pile, who himself reached towards the bleak sky, desperately praying for help. The person was surrounded by the very real thought forms of his victims and the representation of their pain. However hard he pleaded, his voice never reached past the heavy curtain of smoke that shielded and surrounded him like an impregnable bastion. I quickly noticed that this impenetrable layer was made of regret and the realization that the fate of his victims and their suffering could never ever be reversed or erased. It was a wall of absolute impossibility built from his victims' pain and unbearable suffering and the overbearing realization that this was a deed that could never be undone. There were and always will be higher souls trying to help the perpetrators of such awful actions so that they can eventually progress. But one can only guess as to how long this may take. There is no eternal hell, from which there can never be an escape, but for some it must for a very, very long time seem so. One can only imagine the horror of actually and intensely feeling the terror the victims of a suicide bomber or a mass murderer or psychopath may go through. Of course, sooner or later, we all have a life review in the spirit world, and we too have to face how our actions have impacted upon other people. Although, on the bright side, if we have been good and decent folk, we will experience the joy, happiness, laughter and upliftment, and the love that others have enjoyed through our interactions with them. On a personal note, a number of years ago, I was once told that as I slept my spirit was engaged in an aspect of rescue work. Apparently, I would visit former soldiers in a military hospital in spirit that had been created for those who did not realize they had died. The spirit patients believed they were recuperating from wounds they had received in battle. I believe these were soldiers who had lost their physical lives during World War I. My task was to see if I could awaken them to their situation to enable them to take their rightful place in the spirit world. Each soul awakenings in their own time, and until they are ready to do so, no one forces a realization upon them. If any reader wants to read more about how bad the lower realms are, they can also read my book, Escape from Hell.